This is TWiT.
I am delighted to see the performance numbers for the 2060. Apparently, you finally got to finish benchmarking in sleep. Congratulations, sir.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's been a long journey, and I finally got some rest. But yeah, I took the 2060 through its paces at 1440. That was, that's the sweet spot for like the enthusiast segment. Although the numbers, if you look at Steam hardware surveys, are still, sad. 3.89% as of December, or even on a 1440 monitor.
That's up.
Less than 1.5% on UHD, but
it's like twice where it was a year ago or two.
Yeah, I mean, the prices have come down. Growth. We don't have to just get those weird, like brandless monitors on eBay anymore to get that 1440p goodness like we did a few years ago, like the Korean panels and things. But, but the 2060 at 1440 was kind of what they had targeted this as far as performance from the very beginning. So this really gives us a better look. And I love benchmarking at this resolution too, because you get really nice scaling. Like there's no real CPU bottleneck going on. This is a nice resolution to test graphics cards. And if you looked at it, pretty much like before, this is right in between a GTX 1070 and a GTX 1080 from last year. So pretty much on par with the 1070 Ti, which bridged the gap between those two last year. And as I'm going through benchmarking and was looking at all these charts, pretty much at stock speeds, that was the story. And it was, we're talking about a card. Last year, the 1070 Ti was, I believe, $449. And it ranged between $450 and $500 when you could find it without the outrageous Bitcoin mining tax. Mm-hmm. And to have a card that performs at or better than that level about a year later for $100 less is nice. Like, it's one of those things where, once again, we look at the performance of this card and the price of this card, and all I can say is it's fair. It's right about where it should be. We'd always love to see lower prices, but I have a feeling, based on some of the rumors we've already talked about, that we may be seeing that lower cost card. But overclocking is where it really got interesting. And I'm not an expert overclocker. My main goal with overclocking was to see how far I could get the core to go. And OC scanner, that would just work on core speed and doesn't touch memory. I was able to get this stable at plus 170 on the core, pushing power limit and temp limits all the way up. That actually goes higher in games. And I did overclock the memory 500 megahertz, well, 250, 500 effective. And the end result, even with that modest memory overclock, was a card that was very close to an RTX 2070. The first benchmark I ran, just kind of like validating my overclock and make sure everything was stable, was 3D Mark TimeSpy, and there it actually just edged out the 2070, which is kind of crazy. But it was just one test, and that one doesn't always translate to real world game performance. So when I actually ran it through some more tests, it was a little bit behind or closer to tied with the RTX 2070. But it's just one of those things where it took me like no time or effort to flirt with 2070 performance levels where we were within like a millisecond of frame times. And that's, again, coming from a $349 card. And this is the Founders Edition. This doesn't have like a big triple slot cooler or anything on it. It's just, the stock configuration. So,
and I mean, to put this in perspective, in case you aren't obsessively tracking the price of cards right now, a GTX 2070 is, depending on how fancy the manufacturer's gotten, is selling between $500 at the entry level and $660 for some of the, the gold-plated rose gold mayhem-y cards. Not that there is a rose gold GTX 2070, but flirting with 2070 performance with a modest overclock. And given how easy it was, I mean, I don't particularly think you got any bin sorted chips on that. I think this is typical 2060 performance from what we're seeing around the interwebs. But that's a healthy bump in performance. That's flirting, that's like 1080 Ti performance on previous gen GTX cards. That's $150 worth of free GPU on there.
Pretty much, yeah. And it does seem to be kind of across the board. Like you can expect to see boosts of around 2055 I know when I was tweeting about overclocking, Kyle over at HardOCP responded with 2055. Like that was the number. And I got up to 2070 because this card moves in 15 hertz increments. So that's about the boost you can expect from one of these cards if you get it and just push it a little bit with one of these utilities like Precision X or Afterburner. So
that's
very,
pretty
very
epic.
Yeah. And it wasn't like, like every single game at every resolution you're going to see 2070 performance, but you can make it happen. So very impressive overall, and kind of like just reaffirm my initial findings with the card. Like the conclusion basically says like, this is an interesting product. I think it has kind of identity crisis because, the 1060 is such a ubiquitous gaming card. It's such a popular gaming card. It's far and away #1 on the hardware survey. So the 2060 just seemed like that was going to be the heir apparent. And it comes out and it's double the performance of that card and pushing the boundaries of what you'd expect from like a mid-range card. But then the price isn't mid-range either. And that's kind of what we talked about last week too. And I'm not going to belabor the point, but essentially I was actually thinking about this and it's out of arm's reach, but I have an 8800 GTX that I was talking to the staff last night about. And back then when NVIDIA was naming their cards and then giving like appending like a performance level to the end, like GTS, GTX, GT was the lower end, GTX was higher end, and then Ultra was like the overclocked version of the GTX. It's almost like we got the 2060 RTX, and then there'll be like maybe a 2060 like GTX kind of version, but then it may or may not be 2060. So we're still waiting, but this card at this price has a lot of potential. And the thing to keep in mind is that the RTX 2070 is a $500 to $600-ish card. So you are, like you said, $150 of free graphics. That's not bad with just some simple overclocking. And we'll get into like ray tracing and all that kind of stuff in a later article. Right now, I would love to see more than just Battlefield 5. I think everybody's sick of seeing Battlefield 5 coverage at this point. Maybe